So again, I just want to welcome everyone to our webinar on managing classroom behavior using group contingencies. And I want to introduce our presenters, Lisa Radil and Danielle Tobin.
All right, yeah, so thank you for joining us today, everybody. We will be going over managing classroom behavior using group contingencies. As Sonia said, my name is Lisa Radil. I'm a board certified behavior analyst and I work for First Children's Services. And I just want to reiterate one more time, if you have any questions throughout the presentation with regards to the information, feel free to ask those questions in the chat. Afterwards, Danielle and I will just read through the chat, answer your questions, and if you have, at that time, if you have any more questions or want to make any related comments, at the end, you can also feel free at that point to unmute your mic and we can have a little chat.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Danielle Tobin. I am also a board certified behavioral analyst and I work as well for First Children's Services. Okay. All right, so let's dive right in. So let's just go over some basics for some of the individuals that are joining us today that may not know some keywords that you're probably going to hear a lot throughout the presentation. So a contingency, which also refers to the ABCs of behavior, shows that a behavior is elicted by the environment and how consequences can affect its future occurrences. So just to review, going with the ABC, I want to start with antecedent for some of those individuals that may not even know what that is. And antecedent are those environmental conditions or stimulus changes that exist or occur prior to the behavior of interest, right? And then the behavior is the action, what's observable, measurable. And then you have the consequence, which is the stimulus change that follows the behavior that influences the future rate of that behavior. So on the screen, we have a pretty basic example. The teacher flickers the light, the students lower their voices, and then the class is quiet, which is the consequence. You know, there's multiple examples of this, but basically contingencies help us to design interventions that can address how a behavior is elicted and or maintained. So now that we kind of know what a contingency is, a group contingency is a behavior management protocol where a single consequence, which can be a reinforcer or punisher, is given based on either the behavior of an individual in a group, the behavior of a particular set of people within the group, or the group as a whole. Today we're going to review three types of group contingencies. The first one is an interdependent, which is known for all for one. A dependent group contingency is one for all, and then an independent, which is to each his or her own. So hopefully today you guys are going to be able to leave knowing these three objectives: identifying three different types of group contingencies, learning how to implement a group contingency, as well as evaluating the contingency. And then since we're in this whole new virtual era of learning right now, how you can apply these group contingencies to virtual learning. So just some key points about group contingency programs. They're often used best to reduce problematic behaviors, reinforce good behaviors, and also teach important skills. They can help save time and resources in the classroom, and they also help to encourage members of a group to work together as a team. So basically, group contingencies use group reinforcement to capitalize on peer influence. They're also described as an if-then environment behavioral relationship. If the student or group of students exhibits a target behavior to criteria under certain environmental conditions, then someone or something in the environment will deliver that reinforcer. Okay, so let's dive in. We're going to start with the first group contingency today, and that's called a dependent group contingency. It's also known as a hero procedure. The reward for the whole group is dependent on the performance of an individual student or a small group. So if that one individual meets criteria, then the whole class will be able to receive the reward. There are some advantages to a dependent group contingency. They can be individualized as you're only following that one student which we call the hero. So it can be based on his particular needs only. You're not looking at 23 or 28 other students in that class. There's less work for the teacher because you're not tracking many students. You're tracking that one individual student. But the disadvantage of this group contingency could be that that hero, that one dependent student that's going to earn that reward for the whole class, there could be peer pressure and it could stand them out from the group. So you want to be careful when you're using this group contingency. An example of this would be if Liam remains in his seat for all of math class, the whole class will earn 10 minutes of iPad time at the end of math, right? Okay, so he meets the criterion, everyone in the class gets the reward, woohoo, right? But then if Liam doesn't meet that criteria, then unfortunately no one in the class is going to be able to benefit from that reward. That's why we call this group contingency the one for all. The second group contingency is an independent group contingency. This group contingency is based on, everyone in the whole group is given the chance to earn the reinforcer, but only the individual who meets the criterion will get that reinforcer. So students each earn a reward when they achieve the behavioral goal or expectation that was established for the group by the teacher. Every student has the same contingency, but only if you meet that criterion, you're going to be able to get the reward. The advantages of an independent group contingency is the reward is delivered for each individual student behavior. So in that case, peer influence and peer pressure, there's not a lot of it going on because you're individualized. They can also be combined with other reinforcement systems, such as like a token economy. And they foster self-management, right? Because you're individualized, so you're just working on yourself and managing your own behavior. You're not worrying about the group as a whole. Some disadvantages of independent group contingency is there's minimum peer momentum to support the other peers in class. So you're not working together as a team to help build up that behavior momentum to try to reach that reward that you're earning. It doesn't meet everyone's individual needs because you're doing it as a whole group. So it's just one general expectation that you're putting in place, but it may be unfairly put into place for some of the students that may not be able to accomplish that task, like sitting in their seat for a long period of time. And it can be very time consuming on the teacher or whoever's implementing it because you have to track every single student and not just one individual. An example of this would be the entire class would be eligible to get the reward, but only the students who remain in their seats during math class receive the reward. So out of the 5 kids in this picture here, only 3 of them were able to get the reward and the other 2 weren't able to. So that's why we call this group contingency, to each his or her own. And the last group contingency we'll talk about is an interdependent. An interdependent group contingency, all members of the group must meet criterion before any of the students can earn reinforcers. So the group has to establish that criterion to earn the reward. The group's behavior is determined if the group gets access or not to that reinforcer. The advantages of this is everyone is working as a team, and it capitalizes on peer pressure. In this case, it's a good thing because you're trying to build that momentum so that you can earn the reinforcer. And there's some disadvantages with this because you can have sabotaging or blaming others. You have to watch out for those 1 or 2 kids that may not care if they get the reward and try to hurt the group as not getting the reward. An example of this would be if the class receives fewer than 10 marks for off-task behaviors during a period, then the class members get an extra 5 minutes of recess time. So as you see at the top, everyone was able to meet the criterion, so everyone will get the reward. But on the bottom, you see a few did not meet the criterion, so unfortunately, no one in that group is going to get the reward. So again, this is why we call this group contingency all for one.
Danielle, can you just go to the next slide, please? So now that we went over the characteristics that make up the different types of group contingencies, we can talk about implementing them in your classroom. This is a method that has been heavily researched in the past, and what the studies have found is that teachers who effectively implement these models in their classroom are able to spend more time focusing on the academics, because now they don't have to worry about dealing with the challenging behaviors and take time out of their day to do that. You know, we only have X amount of hours during the school day with our kids, so we want to make sure that we can spend as much of that time focusing on the academics as possible to help them, you know, reach their goals and their best potential. So in order to effectively implement these models in your classroom, there's a set of steps that you want to follow to make sure that you're curating an effective plan. And so those steps are selecting the appropriate target behaviors that you want to see change. These could be behaviors for increase or behaviors for decrease. Once you have that, you're going to set the criteria for your students and figure out, you know, what do you want that overall goal to be? What do you want to see your students reach? And then select the most appropriate contingency for your classroom, and that's very individualized based on what kind of rooms you guys run and the students that you have. Choose an effective reward. You know, that's a very important part of this plan. And then once you've done all that, you can begin to implement your plan. So in the following slides, we're going to go over these steps in a little more detail. Okay, so selecting target behaviors that you want to see change. Like I said, these can be behaviors that you want to see more of in your classroom, behaviors that you want to increase, or behaviors that you want to decrease, some challenging behaviors. So for example, of behaviors that you want to see increase in your classroom, this could be in-seat behaviors during lecture time or individual classwork time. If you want to see more participation during certain academic subjects. If you want to work on students raising their hand to ask questions or leave their seats instead of calling out or just getting out of their seat. Or if you want to see overall more positive student interactions. Do you want to foster more teamwork related behaviors in your classroom? Do you want to see students helping each other out on assignments, complimenting each other on different things? Or having more positive, effective conversations with each other during downtime, at recess, or lunch. So any behaviors that you want to see increase, you know, you can target those. Or in turn, you can work on behaviors that you want to see decrease. So these could be any kind of calling out during lessons, during tests, anytime students are just getting out of their seat and being a little disruptive to everybody else in the class. Or if it's not just like one or two, or it's not just a group of students, but it's overall classroom rule breaking that you're struggling with, you can utilize these group contingencies to address those as well. So once you pick the target behaviors that you want to focus on, you can then go ahead and start to figure out how you're going to set goals for your students and the criteria that they need to reach. Especially initially when you're first implementing these plans, you want to make sure that the goals, the criteria is attainable and reasonable, because that's the best way to foster success with these models. And so, for example, if you want to work on class participation during a math lesson, let's say, you're teaching your math lesson, but you're taking a baseline of how many students are participating. If your students are at tables, you know, it's table 5, never really participating during a math question, and you want to see them ask more questions or answer more questions, you take your baseline and you say, okay, I see that at table 5, only 2 students are participating during math, and there's 5 students at that table. Then you can set a goal for each student being able to participate at least once during math. And your initial criteria is very reasonable for the student. So if 2 students out of the 5 are participating, then you might make your goal only 1 time per math lesson each student participates. That way they can learn the contingency. It's easy for them to meet that criteria, so they learn how they can get their rewards. And then over time you can increase it. So, you know, when I say over time you can increase it, I don't mean, you know, over weeks or a month, but, you know, individual times that you're running these contingencies. So let's say that you notice your students are finally meeting the criteria, have that be consistent across 1 or 2 times, maybe 2 or 3 times of implementing it before you then gradually increase it to 2 times of participation during a math lesson for the sake of the example. So 2 examples I have on the slide are if there are 3 or more hand raises consistently across 3 lessons, you can then up it to 4. And the key words in that example is consistently across 3 lessons. So you want to make sure that your students are reaching these goals and meeting this criteria very consistently before you go on and increase it. Another example is if you have 6 callouts or less consistently across the afternoon lessons, you can then decrease it to 4. So gradual is the key here, consistency is a key here, and making sure that you're allowing your students multiple times to practice reaching their criteria before you make it more difficult for them. Okay, so by now you're probably asking yourself, okay, this all sounds great, but there's 3 different types of group contingencies you're talking about. How do I know which is the best for which situation? And so this slide will help explain that a little better. So you want to use dependent group contingencies. Remember, that's the one for all or the hero procedure when you want to just focus on one individual student or just a small group of students within your whole class. So if you notice that you're having issues with calling out at table 5 and table 1, then you can use a dependent group contingency would be great because you just have to focus on those particular students at those tables, and then everybody in the class can earn a reward for their behavior. Dependent models are really good to use for students who respond really well to peer pressure or peer attention. You know, if you have a student that's always calling out during math lesson, he might be doing it or she might be doing it because other students are turning their head and looking at them. Maybe they're getting some laughs out of their peers and they really like that peer attention. Well, you can capitalize on the dependent group contingency and like flip that. So now, instead of gaining their peer attention negatively by calling out, you could say the reward is the whole class gets 10 minutes of iPad time at the end of the period. And we know how much kids love their time on their electronics. So now the student who's calling out, the fate of iPad time rests on his shoulders. And once he reaches that criteria of calling out, you know, let's say only 2 times during a lesson, the class he meets the criteria, the class earns the reward of free iPad time, and now everybody loves that student and he's getting all of that peer attention for earning iPad time for the rest of his class. So again, students who respond really well to peer attention, dependent is a great model to use for them. So for the independent group contingency, this is good to use if you want to work on behaviors such as handing their work in on time, increasing study time to get a particular score on their test, because these are really easy for the teacher to track. Independent group contingencies are tough for teachers who are, you know, the sole adult in their classroom, because if I'm the only adult and I have 25 to 30 students and I have to work on calling out during a lesson, well, now I'm focusing on teaching my lesson. I'm focusing on who's calling out and who's not calling out, making sure I'm taking data on that, and it just becomes too much. So in a general ed classroom or a classroom with one teacher and a large group of kids, behaviors such as handing in work on time, maybe sitting and doing independent work, in-seat behavior will be a little easier for the teachers to track. In addition, this contingency is really good for students who don't respond well to peer pressure or peer attention. Because now if you have a student who the fate of iPad time rests on his shoulders, but that causes him a lot of anxiety or causes this student to turn inward and shut down a little bit, dependent is not the answer for that student. Independent is, because they don't have to worry about earning the reward for the rest of their class. They just have to focus on earning the reward for themselves. And so in that case, an independent group contingency would be better. And then you have interdependent group contingency. So this is good to use when you want to foster teamwork-related behaviors, if you want to focus on increasing or decreasing the amount of time it takes for a student to complete an assignment in class. You know, let's say after the reading lesson, you give the class independent reading work to do, but you notice it's taking like a half hour for them to get it done, 40 minutes, and you think this is too much time. I need to move on with the rest of my lessons for the day. An interdependent group contingency would be great because you can set a goal for the whole class. You know, let's really focus on getting this work done within 15 or 20 minutes instead of 30 or 40. And in turn, you foster teamwork-related behaviors because now the students who finish early can help other students in their class and, you know, really build leadership skills and teamwork-related skills to get them done. And it's good for the teacher because now maybe you won't have a line of 10 students at your desk wanting to ask questions because you have your students helping each other out. So these are just a few examples of situations where each contingency would be better for. So now you've got your behaviors, you're setting your criteria, you picked your contingency, it's time to choose an effective reward. And this might be the most important part of the whole process because a reward is what sets the motivation for these students to want to engage in these behaviors. You know, they're not, a lot of times, you know, we don't really engage in behaviors unless we know that maybe there's something in it for us. You know, we work for money and these students are working for a reward. And so it's very important to keep the students involved in this process. So, you know, you want to make sure that you have their input because they're the ones that are earning the reward and it has to be effective for them. So some ways that you could do this is just observing your classroom, seeing where your students are gravitating towards in the room. Is it art supplies? Is it electronics? Is it board games? You can create a survey for your students to fill out, maybe for the older kids on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 of different ideas that you have or things you notice that they like. You could just have a conversation with your class and ask them and take notes on what they say of what is going to be motivating for them. So once you decide what your reward is going to be, it's important to have a plan to know where you're going to implement this reward. Is it something that you can just stay in your classroom and they're going to get in the room? Are you going outside? You know, is it going to be extra time at recess or teaching a reading lesson sitting outside on the grass instead of in the classroom on a nice day? This is all very, very important and to make sure that you have down pat before you start to implement this procedure. So now you've done all that and you're almost ready to implement your plan. A couple of things to do directly before starting it is to communicate the plan to your class. Keep them in the know. Let the students know what you're going to be looking for. Let the students know what they need to do to meet this criteria. How many times does a student have to engage in this behavior to meet the criteria? What exactly are the students going to be earning? They need to know all of this information in order to see success with these plans. You also want to create a visual for your classroom so the students can track their progress. So, you know, establish a tracking method is important to have ready to go. Are you going to be taking tally marks on these behaviors? Is it going to be like a yes or no chart? And make sure that it's in an area of the classroom that the students can easily see. That way they know how much more they need to do. They know where they stand as far as the criteria. It's also like another set of motivation for the students to, you know, really engage in these positive behaviors that we want to see or decrease these negative behaviors. And then select a time limit for the group contingency. Especially when you are just starting to implement it, you want to make sure that it's just short increments of time that you're running these models. So it's not like you're starting it on Monday and you're not evaluating the data until Friday and the students aren't getting their reward till Friday. Well then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they might not be as motivated to engage in these behaviors if they know that they're not getting their reward until Friday. So that's really important to have as well. So you want to make sure you're just running it within certain academic times, within, you know, 15 to 20 minutes maybe before lunch or in the beginning of the day. if you're in a high school or middle school, you know, the students, maybe they're taking too long at their lockers and they're not getting to class on time fast enough. So that could be a good time. Just the first 15 minutes of the first class period. Again, it'll be super individualized. It is totally up to you guys, what you notice the issues are, where you see the challenges, but the short increments of time are really, really important, particularly when you are just initiating these plans for the first time. And then, like anything else, consistency is very important, and follow through. Whatever reward you decide you're going to give your class, make sure you're following through with that and you're really giving them what you say you're going to give them. It builds trust with the students, and it's best to see success in the future. So what I did here was I took one example, but I molded it to fit the different types of contingencies, just as another way to help you understand it a little better, maybe make it a little clearer as to exactly how these contingencies foster the delivery of reinforcement. So this example has to do with talking out during a reading lesson, and the reward for the class is 5 minutes of free time. So if for a dependent group contingency, if one person receives 3 or fewer marks for talking out during a reading lesson, then the whole class gets 5 minutes of free time. So this is that hero procedure, the one for all. We're focusing solely on one student who has an issue with talking out during reading. Their criteria is 3 or fewer marks, and if they meet that, then the whole class gets to earn 5 minutes of free time. For an interdependent group contingency, this would look like if the whole class receives 3 or fewer marks for talking out during a reading lesson, then the whole class gets 5 minutes of free time. This is the all or none. So now we're looking at the whole class with 25 to 30 students. There better only be 3 or less call outs during my reading lesson. And if you meet that, then you can get 5 minutes of free time. And if you're looking at it from the perspective of an independent group contingency, this would look like if each person receives 3 or fewer marks for talking out during a reading lesson, then each student will get 5 minutes of free time. And this is where it comes in, where our interdependent might be hard for the teacher to track, especially the behavior of calling out, because now they're teaching their lesson. At the same time, they have to go student by student, making sure they're only doing 3 or fewer call outs. It doesn't really fit well in this example. But, just for the sake of the example, if 25 students in a class and there's only 8 that called out 3 or less, then only those 8 students get free time, and everybody else has to move on to the next assignment or do a busy work academic assignment. So that would be the independent group contingency there. Okay, this is a really cool game where we can either play it as a dependent group contingency or as an interdependent group contingency. And this is a game that you can find online. It's called the 3-jar game. So basically what this is you have 3 jars, 3 empty jars, and on the first jar, you write behavior. On the second jar, you write who, and on the third jar, you write reward. And these are the 3 parts of our group contingency. So, in the behavior jar, you want to write down behaviors that you want to see more of in your classroom. So I want to see in my classroom more participation during math. I want to see students taking their notes, and I want to see students staying in seat when I'm delivering directions. So I write them on little sheets of paper, and into the behavior jar they go. In the who jar, you write table 1, table 5, because I noticed that they're really struggling with some of these behaviors. Individual names of students that are struggling, and then maybe the whole class. And for the reward jar, I did my observations, I did my survey, I talked to my students, and what I found is that they find 5 minutes of free time really reinforcing, playing a whole class game, heads up or 4 corners, really reinforcing, or the privilege of sitting at the teacher's desk during independent work, because little kiddos really love that. So before you go and start your math lesson, you explain everything to the students. They know each slip of paper that went into each jar, and you start to pull papers out. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to be focusing on, and out of the jar comes copying notes. And then you go to the who jar and you say, before I start this lesson, out of the who jar comes table 5. And so you say, okay, table 5, while I'm doing math, I'm going to be keeping my eye on you guys, making sure that you're taking your notes. And maybe you'll write the names of all the students at table 5 down on the whiteboard so they can see it. So you go ahead and you're teaching your lesson and you're glancing over at table 5 and, you know, okay, I see Billy's taking notes. So you put a check mark next to his name and every other name that you wrote down. After the lesson, you analyze your data and you say, okay, I noticed that everybody at table 5 was taking notes while I was doing math. Maybe you walk over there, glance at their notebooks really quickly to double check and make sure they weren't just writing nonsense down. And so everybody took notes. So, okay, Johnny, why don't you come up and pull a reward out of the reward jar? And Johnny pulls out class game. So now that everybody at table 5 met the criteria, the whole class gets to play a game. And that would be a dependent group contingency. And when I say this is a fun way to mix it up, is because if you pulled out the slip that said whole class, and now you're looking at the whole class during your math lesson, seeing if they're taking notes. If they do, then the whole class gets to earn the reward, and that would be an interdependent group contingency.
Another game that you can use using group contingencies is called the good behavior game. And the good behavior game uses an interdependent group contingency to increase self-regulation, group regulation, and stimulate pro-social behavioral among students while reducing problematic behaviors. So through the good behavior game, children work together to create a positive and friendly learning environment by monitoring their own behavior as well as that of their peers. The good behavior game has also been proven to reduce aggression, disruptive behavior, and increase on-task behaviors for students as well. Okay, so how do you play this game? So the first thing you're going to do is decide on the time to play. This could be during certain class periods, certain times of the day where their kids have a harder time settling down. Maybe it's coming in the morning. Maybe it's during math class. Maybe it's right after recess, whatever that subject is. So you're going to decide on that time of the day. Then you're going to decide, you're going to divide the class into 2 to 4 teams. Once you do that, you're going to explain the rules. You're either going to verbally tell them, you could write them down, you could visually display them, or you can do all 3, depending on the learners that you have in your class. You're going to include what happens when they follow the rules and what happens when they don't follow the rules. You're going to talk about how long the game's going to be played and what happens when the team meets the criteria, that they'll be able to receive the reward, and the teams that don't meet the criteria will not receive the reinforcers. So you want to make sure that the points or the goal or reinforcers, what you're working for this game, is visual out for the students to see so that they have a reference and they can help build up the other peers in the group, and also they can manage their own points as well. And then at the end of the game, you want to debrief with the class. This is a good opportunity so that you can get feedback as a teacher or whoever is implementing it, what could have been done differently. And then also this is a great opportunity for the teacher to explain some things that they saw, what they liked best. And it's just a good time to kind of run through and make sure, everyone understands too what happened throughout the game. Now, again, this is going to be played during instructional time. So it's going to move quickly, and you're not bringing attention out to behavior during this time. During this 20 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever the time limit is that you set for it, you're going to be going through your lecture, your whatever it is that you're teaching or doing, and you're just going to be putting tallies down, which I'll show you some examples later, and while doing your lesson and keep going. You're not stopping, you're not going to talk about anything at that time. That's why at the end of the game, it gives you that time to debrief with the students. Okay, so these are some examples of some of the rules. Again, these aren't set in stone. You're going to individualize these to your classrooms or the groups that you're working with. So some of the rules or expectations that you can put in place are only talking when the teacher calls on you, raising your hand, asking teachers permission if you need to leave your seat, only touching things that belong to you and not your peers, stuff on their desk, handing assignments and staying in your seat. Again, these are going to be individualized. Some of these aren't going to work for high school students. Some of them won't work for, kindergarten students. So you want to take that into consideration when you're setting up your rules and expectations. And examples of rewards kind of goes hand in hand, right? So they're individualized. You're going to do surveys, maybe you'll hand out to the students to see what it is that they want to work for, or you have a group discussion about it. Maybe you reach out to parents if you have students that aren't really motivated, or you don't know what's motivating enough for them. So you reach out to the parents to try to get that information. So some examples of these would be lining up first for lunch, 10 minutes of free time at the end of the day, extra go noodle videos, tablet times, drumming on your desk, cell phone time, free homework pass. Again, these are individualized to even schools that you're in, because I work in like the middle school and the high schools. So, lining up first for lunch isn't really an option for maybe a junior that I'm working with, and he could probably care less. So again, you're going to individualize these to the students that you're working with. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can play this game. There's not one like rule or expectation that's set in place to do it. So there's different variations that you can do. So you want to be kind of fun and creative with it. So you do it different times of the day during different subject matters, vary the frequency or the access or the payoff that you have, vary the teams, switch the teams around maybe during the different subjects. And the rules, maybe one day you're going to work on in-seat behavior, but maybe the next day you're going to work on, keeping your hands to yourself, depending on, again, on the learners that you're working with. Varying the behavioral expectations, the incentives, right? Because if you keep using the same reward over and over again, eventually the student's not going to care if you give them 5 minutes of extra recess time or an extra Go Noodle video, because they're over at that point. So you want to kind of have a list of different types of rewards or incentives that you can switch it up a little bit, or even give them the option of, okay, what do you want to play or reward? What kind of reward would you like for today? There's other little things too that you could do, like using a mystery motivator, which is basically like a surprise. So you can have like a piece of paper, like Lisa had mentioned, in jars where the student can pick a reinforcer out, or maybe you have an envelope with like a question mark on it, and there's a card inside and it has like a new reinforcer that they've never even seen or had a privilege to get yet. Better behavior boosters, those are an extra incentive. So maybe, on top of the 5 extra minutes of recess you have, maybe you're going to give them a booster and be like, hey, instead of 5 today, you're going to get 10 extra minutes of recess. And then merit cards, these are where you can go around to the groups and kind of give the students in the group like extra bonus points. Maybe one of the students was helping another student, so you would give them like a merit card, and then those could be added to extra points at the end of the game. So again, there's many different variations of playing this game. You're going to work what's best for you and for the students that you're working with. These are just some examples of how they could be tracked. This is a very simple way, just having team numbers and then using Velcro pieces and putting stars up. This one is actually one of my favorites, and it's the most easiest one because you could just write on the whiteboard, but I like it because it has the goal or the incentive that they're working for. It's visually put there so the students can use it as a reference. Like this one says, being a good listener, and then it's broken down into 3 teams. And again, you're just putting tallies. Here's another one on the bottom by the class rules. You see the good behavior game team assignment chart, and then it has the students' names with the team 1, and then you put the tallies in the column next to it. Again, to being creative, you can have the kids even pick names for their teams if you want to as well.
Okay, so we've gone over the group contingencies, how to implement it in your classroom, provided some examples, but it's important to talk about how you're evaluating these contingencies to see if you're having success with them or not. So how are you going to collect data on all the different types? You know, how do you know when it's time to increase or decrease your data as you're going along? And this is all really important to meet your overall goal and find success in the future. So with that being said, there is a way to take data based on the research. What we found is the easiest way for teachers to take data is something called PLA check, which is a planned activity check. And this is a way to measure group behavior based on the time intervals that I was previously talking about. So for example, if you're running something during a reading lesson and reading is 40 minutes, now you're going to take that 40-minute interval and you're going to break it down into smaller chunks of interval of time. So maybe 2 minutes or 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. It all depends on what's easiest for you as a teacher in your classroom. But the reason we do this is because you set a timer for that amount of time. So if I have a 40-minute class and I set my shorter intervals for 5 minutes, once the timer goes off, all you have to do is glance up, look at your students, see who's engaging in the behavior, who's not engaging in the behavior, take your tallies, write down your check marks, and then reset the timer and continue on. So it's fast and really easy. But a disadvantage to this is that during that shorter interval of time, you might miss some behaviors going on in the classroom. So there's pros and cons to everything. There's advantages and disadvantages to everything. But depending on how short you set of an interval of time you set your timer for, you'll be able to catch more behaviors. So that's something to keep in mind. In the following slides, we'll have examples of data sheets to help you analyze your data and organize it. So in the next data sheet we have here is we're tracking off-task behavior. So in the far left column, you have your intervals 1 through 10. Then you have the number of students engaging in off-task behavior. You have your target student and the number of students engaging in on-task behavior. This sheet is really good for an independent or a dependent group contingency because your target student, you have your target student. Who exactly are you focusing on? And we have the number of students off task and the number of students on task as a point of reference. So as your intervals are going on and you're taking your data, you could circle your target student. Are they on task? Are they off task? But then you can compare it to the other students in class and see if they're following in line with everybody else, if they're performing above everybody else, if they're performing below everybody else. So this gives you a lot of really good information on this sheet. If you wanted to run a dependent group contingency, but it's within a small group of students instead of one particular student, you can just change the title of the middle column, or you can take that out and just have the number of students off task. Maybe on the top of the paper, you know, you'll have table 5. Poor table 5. I feel like I'm always picking on them in this presentation. And then at the bottom, the total number of times the student was engaging in that behavior. So this sheet might look a little more intimidating, but the only difference is instead of having 10 intervals, now this gives you 60 intervals of time, which gives you a lot of information to look at and draw conclusions from. So you have on the top all your basic information. Who are you observing, the time, the subject. You have the student's name on the far left, and then your intervals of time. So, you know, this sheet is set up so you can track maybe 3 students at once. If you wanted to run an interdependent group contingency or focus on small groups, you could just either take out the column of students' names, or you can change it to who exactly you're tracking. And then as the intervals of times go on, for example, if you're running an interdependent and you're just focusing on the whole class, when your timer goes up and you glance up to observe your students and see who's engaging in this behavior or not, you can just put the number in that box and then move on if it's for the whole class. And you could see as it's going on, are they hitting the numbers to meet that criteria or not? On the bottom of this sheet, there's room for some qualitative info. So for example, if you notice something interesting went on with one of your students, maybe during the interval 10, at the bottom of the sheet, you can put interval 10, the student, and you could take your notes, something interesting that maybe you want to remember for later or that you thought was worth noting during that time. And then on the other side of the paper on the far right, it has some columns for you to compute your data, maybe into percentages, and to get a better picture of what's going on in the classroom. So this sheet gives you a lot of information, a lot of intervals you can track. In the next one, I like this one because it has the column of was my goal met? So again, like every other sheet, you have your intervals. This is tracking number of hand raises. So, you have that column to put at the end of the interval. There was 4, 6, whatever. And then in the far right column, it has was my goal met during this interval? And you have your criteria right under there. And you can just put a quick yes or no if during that specific interval it was met or not. This makes it super easy to see if there's consistency happening, because you could just look and say, okay, well, during my first 3 intervals, they only met their criteria once, but I noticed during 4, 5, and 6, they're consistently hitting that mark. And so that'll signal to you, okay, maybe I can increase it very gradually or decrease it very gradually. So this is another way you can design a data sheet to make it very easy for yourself. In the next sheet, we have classwork activities. You have your interval duration set to just being 1 minute, and then the number of students out of seat. So here we're taking tallies. My timer is going off every 1 minute. I'm looking up, analyzing, who am I looking at? That's important to know. Is it, table 5? Is it one particular student? Is it interdependent for the whole class? So you can do that. And then if you want, you can add on that extra column of just a simple yes or no if my goal was met or not. So those are just some different examples of data sheets, different ways you can track it. But, it's going to be whatever works best for you, whatever makes the most sense for you. But, just the fact that you are tracking data is very, very important, because that is what you're going to use to drive your decision making. That's what you're going to use to see if it, in an objective way, if your intervention or contingency is effective or not. And then you could say, okay, if it's not, then there's something I need to change. And then it'll prompt you to look a little deeper into exactly what the criteria is, what the behavior is, to notice if there's things that you have to change or not. Okay, so by now, you've probably heard the word contingency so much your head is spinning, but there's just a short little part of the presentation left, and that is how can we compute this to telehealth? Because you might be saying to yourself, like, okay, guys, this all sounds great, but I'm not even in my classroom right now. I'm with my students online. So how can I take all this information and mold it to fit the video conferencing platform that you're all, Zooming in with your students now? So the way you design it is exactly the same. You're going to select your target behaviors, and they might be different now than behaviors in the classroom. And we're going to go over some different types of behaviors, examples that maybe you're noticing, or maybe you're not thinking of, but it'll spark like, oh, this kind of is an issue that I'm having. So you're going to look at your behaviors, observe the students, see what's going on now. You're going to set criteria again. You're going to see what is a more appropriate group contingency. And being that everything is, digital now, it might be a dependent or independent group contingency. Maybe you're having an issue with all of your students not handing their homework in on time, or Zooming into class on time. So it could be, any of the group contingencies can apply to the telehealth-based platform. you're going to choose an effective reward. And this is where you have to get really creative and see, you know, what do my students find reinforcing right now? And then communicate all of that to your students, all of it to their families. You know, if you're working in the elementary schools with the littler kids, maybe you're communicating this information to their parents, and you can begin to implement your plan.
Okay, so like Lisa had mentioned, some behaviors that you might want to see increase or decrease. Of course, these are going to look different than in an actual classroom. So we have like attending to the screen. If you're working with the little ones, it's hard to have them focus in and pay attention to the screen, muting and unmuting your microphone, submitting work on time. Maybe it's turning the video camera on and off. There's probably other ones that you could think of, like sitting down in a seat. I work with a little guy that it's hard to get him to just sit, like he's just constantly moving and moving the camera around. So again, they're individualized. And then you want to be really creative with reinforcement, because you're not there to actually give a tangible or give something to a kid, give extra recess time. So you have to be creative, such as having a dance party via Zoom, a house tour, playing different videos. I had someone wanted to see the inside of my refrigerator. If you have kids and you're working with kids, maybe they're really into PJ Masks or Lightning McQueen cars, and you have some of those things, you can, use those figurines at the end of your sessions. Again, you're going to, ask the student what it is that they want to work for, what's motivating enough for them. You can ask the parents, the teachers, you can do questionnaires or surveys. You're going to be creative. This is kind of like thinking outside the box. It's new for all of us, and we're all kind of learning as we're going. So, this opens up a whole new area for research as well. But since it's been a couple months by now, I'm pretty sure that a lot of people have kind of started the whole evidence-based research on group contingencies via telehealth. So, that's pretty much our presentation today. Thank you.
So I guess what we'll do now is we'll look at the chat and we'll see if anybody typed any questions into there. If you want to make any related comments, if you have questions right now, feel free to unmute your mic and we can have a little chat. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for coming.
Yes, thank you again for sharing the afternoon with us.
Yeah. Sharing with us. Okay, let's see the chat.
I don't see any questions, but thank you.
Any question? Yeah, thank you so much for all of your positive feedback. It means so much to us. You've worked really hard on this, so it's very reinforcing for us to see that. Thank you.
I also want to remind everyone one last time, if you would like the professional development certificate, please put your full name into the chat. And I will be sending out the PowerPoint presentation and the recording of this video.
Thank you guys for coming.